The dust had barely settled on the stagecoach road into Harlan Creek, Colorado, when Paul Carver stepped down from the coach in the autumn of 1882 with a leather satchel full of legal papers and a dead man's last wishes folded neatly against his chest. He had ridden 3 days from Denver, bouncing across sun-baked plains and through mountain passes that smelled of pine and iron, and he had not slept more than 4 hours in any given stretch. His coat was the color of river mud from the journey, and his dark hair was pressed flat against his forehead from the hat he wore to keep the afternoon glare from blinding him. He was 31 years old, a lawyer by trade, a man of documents and careful language, and he had made this particular trip because the senior partner at the firm of Dunmore and Carver in Denver had believed, incorrectly, that delivering an inheritance notice in person was the civilized and dignified approach. Paul had learned on the first day of the ride that dignity had very little to do with anything out here. The town of Harlan Creek was not what anyone would call impressive. It had a main street of packed earth that turned to slick mud whenever it rained, a row of wooden storefronts that leaned slightly as though exhausted by their own existence, a saloon called the Copper Bell that was already generating noise, though it was barely past 2 in the afternoon, and a church at the far end of the street whose white paint was peeling in long ribbons like old skin. But there was something else about the town that Paul noticed before he had taken 10 steps toward the main thoroughfare, and that was the sound of hammering, not the casual hammer strikes of a man doing minor repairs. This was organized, rhythmic, purposeful hammering, coming from the far eastern edge of town, where a wide lot had been cleared and framed up into what appeared to be the skeleton of a large building. He counted the workers from where he stood. 7 men, moving with efficiency, shouting instructions to one another. And in the middle of all of it, standing atop a half-built wall frame with a hammer in her own hand, was a woman. She was not what he expected, though he would later admit to himself that he had not known what to expect. She was perhaps 26 years old, with dark auburn hair coiled and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better years. Her dress was practical rather than fashionable, a deep indigo skirt and a cream blouse with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and she moved along that wall frame with the ease of someone who had no particular fear of heights or hard work. She called something down to one of the men below, and he responded with a wave and adjusted the beam he was guiding into position. Paul stood and watched for a long moment, his satchel hanging at his side, and he was aware of a strange feeling that he could not immediately name, something between admiration and confusion. He had ridden 3 days to deliver papers to a woman he had assumed would be waiting, bereaved and perhaps uncertain, in a small house somewhere, needing the information he carried as a lifeline. What he saw instead was a woman who appeared to be very much in motion and not waiting for anyone at all. He asked the man at the general store about her, and the man, whose name was Ebb Fletcher and who seemed delighted to have a stranger to talk to, lit up immediately. "That would be Sarah Lockhart," Ebb said, reaching across the counter to adjust a jar of peppermint sticks. "Old Thomas Lockhart's daughter. She came back to Harlan Creek about 4 months ago after her father passed, God rest him. Most folks figured she would sell the property and go back east to wherever she had been living before. She did not sell," Paul said. "It was not a question." "She did not sell," Ebb confirmed with a grin. "Instead, she hired every spare hand in the county and started tearing down that old granary on the east end and putting up what she says will be the finest boarding house this side of the Continental Divide. She has got plans drawn on paper and everything. She argues with the lumber supplier like she was born to it." Paul thanked the man and stepped back out into the afternoon light. He looked down the street toward the construction again, toward the small figure moving atop the frame with such certainty, and he squared his shoulders and walked toward her. He had a job to do. He had documents to deliver. The fact that she was already building something with her own hands was, strictly speaking, none of his professional concern. He told himself that all the way to the edge of the lot. Sarah Lockhart saw the stranger coming from a good distance because she had a habit of watching the road when she was up high. She had learned that from her father years before he died, that a person with any sense kept one eye on what was approaching and one eye on what needed doing right in front of them. The man walking toward the lot was City. She could see that from his coat and the way he carried himself, but he was not soft. There was something in the way he moved, deliberate and direct, that told her he was not the sort of person who wandered or strayed. He was coming specifically for something. She finished driving the nail she had started, tucked the hammer into her belt, and climbed down the ladder with practiced ease, arriving at ground level just as he reached the edge of the lot. "Good afternoon," he said, and his voice surprised her. It was steady and warm, not the clipped, efficient tone she had expected from someone who dressed like that. "I am looking for Miss Sarah Lockhart." "You found her," she said. He blinked just slightly, and she registered the brief recalibration happening behind his eyes. She had seen that look before. Men who came expecting something that did not match what they found. "My name is Paul Carver," he said. "I am an attorney from Denver, with the firm of Dunmore and Carver. I have been retained in connection with the estate of your late father, Thomas Lockhart, and I have traveled here to deliver certain documents pertaining to that estate and to your inheritance." Sarah pulled off her work gloves and tucked them in her skirt pocket. "My father passed 6 months ago, Mr. Carver. I was under the impression that his estate had already been settled with the county clerk." "The land and the main holdings, yes," Paul said. He reached into the satchel and produced a sealed envelope. "But there was a secondary matter, a deposit account held with the First National Bank of Denver, which your father had established some years ago under a different name as a precaution against certain creditors. That account was only recently identified and verified. The funds are substantial." Sarah took the envelope. She did not open it. She looked at him with eyes that were the color of creek water in autumn, something between green and gold, and he found it surprisingly difficult to maintain his professional composure under that steady gaze. "How substantial," she said. $3,412, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the building frame behind her, at the men working and the lumber stacked in careful rows and the barrels of hardware she had sourced from 3 different towns. "That is almost exactly what I am short to finish this building," she said, not to him specifically, more to the air, as though the world had just made a peculiar and specific joke at her expense. "I was not aware you were building," he said. "No reason you would be," she replied. She finally looked back at him, and there was something in her expression that was not quite amusement but lived near it. "Well, Mr. Carver, I suppose you had better come inside and have some coffee while I read through these papers. I am staying at the Wickfield house at the end of Elm Street. Mrs. Wickfield takes in boarders." "So do I, apparently," Paul said, and then looked briefly startled by his own words as though he had not meant to say them out loud. Sarah raised one eyebrow. "I beg your pardon. I only meant that I will also need a room while I am in town. The documents require your signature and notarization, and the notary, I am told, comes through Harlan Creek only on Thursdays." "Today is Monday," Sarah said. "Yes," Paul said, "it is." She considered him for another moment, this city lawyer standing in the dust of her construction site with his leather satchel and his slightly mud-stained coat, and she made a decision the same way she made all her decisions, quickly and without excessive ceremony. "Mrs. Wickfield has rooms," she said. "Tell her I sent you. She will give you a fair rate." She turned and walked back toward the construction, pulling her gloves back on as she went, and Paul Carver stood at the edge of the lot for just a moment longer than was strictly necessary before he turned toward the far end of Elm Street. He stayed 3 nights at Mrs. Wickfield's because the notary did not come through on Thursday, having been delayed in Glenwood Springs by a dispute over mining titles that required his attention. The notary's absence extended Paul's stay by another week, and then another, and by the time all the relevant documents were properly signed and witnessed and sealed for the return journey to Denver, nearly 3 weeks had passed. 3 weeks, it turned out, was enough time for many things. The first morning he woke in Harlan Creek, Paul walked down to the construction site early because he was by nature an early riser, and because Mrs. Wickfield's biscuits were not ready until 7, and he had nothing else to do with his hands at 5:30 in the morning. He expected to find the lot empty at that hour. He found Sarah Lockhart standing in the gray pre-dawn light with a set of plans spread across a sawhouse, a lantern beside her, and a pencil tucked behind her ear, measuring and remarking and muttering quietly to herself. He stood at the edge of the lot again and did not intrude. He watched her work, the way she ran her finger along the drawn lines of the plan, and then looked up at the frame and calculated something in her head, her lips moving slightly. After a few minutes she looked over and saw him and did not seem particularly startled. "Mr. Carver," she said by way of acknowledgement. "Miss Lockhart," he said, "I did not want to interrupt." "You are not interrupting, I am only thinking." She straightened and looked at the building frame. "I am trying to decide whether to add a covered porch on the south side. The afternoon sun hits that face hard in summer. Guests would want shade." He came a few steps closer because she seemed to be genuinely thinking aloud and not dismissing him. "A covered porch would add to the lumber cost," he said. "It would," she said. "But a boarding house without comfort is only slightly better than sleeping in the street. People will pay more for somewhere that feels like a home." "What made you decide on a boarding house?" he asked. He was curious, genuinely, not as small talk. She was quiet for a moment, rolling the pencil between her fingers. "When I was 17, my father sent me to live with my aunt in St. Louis so I could get a proper education. I was there for 5 years. When I came back west, my aunt could not afford to keep her own house anymore, and she spent 2 years living in a series of boarding houses. Some of them were terrible. Dark and cold and managed by people who saw their guests as a nuisance rather than a livelihood." She paused. "One of them was wonderful. The woman who ran it was named Dolores Reyes, and she had fresh flowers on every table, and she knew the name of everyone who came through her door, and she remembered what each person took in their coffee." Paul was quiet, listening. "Dolores saved my aunt's dignity during a difficult time," Sarah said. "I always thought I would do something like that someday. When my father died and I came back and saw this empty lot and the need this town has for something decent, it seemed like the right time." She looked at the frame again. "He left me the land. The granary was falling apart anyway. I do not think he would mind that I tore it down. I think," Paul said carefully, "that from what I was able to learn about your father in the course of handling this estate, he would have been very proud of you." She looked at him with a directness that he was already learning was simply her way. "You are kind to say that. Did you know him?" "Not personally, only through documents, but a man's papers tell you a great deal about him." He met her gaze. "He kept very careful track of everything that mattered to him, including that account in Denver. He wrote a note that was sealed with it. I brought it with the documents. It is yours along with the rest." Something shifted in her expression, a softness that she did not otherwise easily show. "I have not opened it yet," she said. "I am not certain I am ready to." He nodded. "There is no deadline on that one." They stood together in the early gray light, and the sound of the wind moving through the unfinished frame of the building was the only sound between them, and neither of them seemed in any particular hurry to end the moment. The next several days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Paul had no real reason to remain at the site since his business in town was simply waiting for the notary. But Mrs. Wickfield's house was quiet, and he was a man who did not do well with too much stillness. He found himself gravitating to the construction lot each morning, at first telling himself he was simply taking the air, and then, after the third day, abandoning the pretense entirely. He would arrive with 2 cups of coffee from the diner 2 streets over, one for himself and one for Sarah, and she would accept hers without making a fuss over it, and they would stand at the sawhouse looking at the plans while the crew began to arrive. He found, to his own surprise, that he had some useful knowledge about building. His father had been a carpenter in his working years, before injury had pushed him into other trades, And Paul had spent enough of his boyhood holding boards and fetching tools that he understood the basics of construction with a practical instinctiveness that his legal training had not erased. When the crew ran into difficulty with the calculations for the roofline pitch, it was Paul who crouched in the dust and worked through the geometry on the back of a legal pad, and the foreman, a gruff and initially skeptical man named Bert Calloway, took the figures and nodded with grudging respect. "You are surprisingly useful for a lawyer," Sarah said, the afternoon that happened. "I try not to be only one thing," he said. She looked at him sideways, not quite smiling but with something warm in her expression. "My father said that once. He said a man who is only one thing is only worth one thing." They were getting more comfortable with each other. The careful formality of the first day was loosening at the edges, not replaced by familiarity exactly, but by something more honest, a mutual recognition that they were both people who said what they meant and did not put much stock in performance. On the fifth evening he was in town, there was a community gathering at the church hall, the sort of thing Harlan Creek apparently hosted every few weeks so that its scattered residents could conduct the social business of a small town, share information, settle minor disputes, and eat whatever various households had contributed to the common table. Sarah went because she needed to speak with a man named Hodges about a shipment of glass for the windows. She told Paul about it at the construction site, and he had said nothing in particular. And then that evening, somewhat to his own amusement, he found himself putting on his cleaner coat and walking toward the church hall. She was talking to Hodges when he arrived, and she caught his eye across the room, and there was a brief, wordless communication between them, something like pleased recognition. He found himself talking to various townspeople, a doctor named Ferris who had opinions about public hygiene and expressed them at length, a rancher named Webb who wanted to know if Paul knew anything about water rights law, and an elderly woman named Clara Moss who had apparently known Paul's father's family and was delighted to have made this connection, which Paul could not quite explain or verify, but did not have the heart to dispute. Later in the evening, when the gathering had loosened into something more relaxed and people were sitting with plates of food and talking in smaller clusters, Sarah found her way to where Paul was standing near the window. "Did you get the glass sorted out with Hodges?" he asked. "He says it will be another 2 weeks for the window order," she said. "Which is actually fine because the framing needs to be further along before we can set the windows anyway. But I wanted it confirmed." She looked out the window at the darkened street. "I am used to things not going quite at the pace I planned. You learn to adjust. Is that a lesson from the construction or from life in general?" She considered this. "Both, I suppose. When I came back to Harlan Creek I had a very precise plan. 6 months to build, 3 months to furnish and prepare, open in the spring. The plan has already shifted twice. Does that bother you? Less than it used to." She glanced at him. "What about you? Are you a man who keeps to a plan?" He thought about it honestly. "I am a man who makes plans and then becomes quietly frustrated when they change and then eventually adapts. I am better at adapting than I used to be." "What changed you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I had a case 2 years ago. A family had been waiting on a land decision for 3 years and I had planned every legal argument perfectly. The judge ruled against us anyway, not because of the law or the arguments, because of politics and money and the way certain men in Denver had arranged things to benefit themselves." He looked out the window too. "I could not fix it with planning. I could only find a different way through. We found one, eventually, but it took longer and cost more than it should have." She looked at him with a new quality of attention. "Did you get the family their land?" "We got them fair compensation for the land they had lost," he said. "It was not everything, but it was something they could live on." "That matters," she said quietly. "Yes," he said. "It does." They stood near the window in a silence that felt easy rather than empty, and at some point, without either of them marking exactly when it happened, they had turned slightly so that they were facing each other rather than the window, and the space between them had narrowed, not dramatically, but noticeably, as though some invisible current was gently insisting on the reduction of distance. The church hall around them continued its hum of conversation and laughter and the clinking of plates, and Paul Carver stood in the lamplight and thought that he could not remember the last time a conversation had felt this much like something he needed. The notary finally arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks late, a tidy little man named Abernathy who apologized profusely for the delay and produced his seal with the flourish of someone who was well aware of his own importance in a region that had limited access to official documentation. Paul and Sarah sat across from each other at the long table in the county clerk's office, and the papers were witnessed and signed and sealed. The inheritance officially and legally released to Sarah Lockhart, $3,412 to be transferred from the Denver account to whatever bank she directed. When they stepped out of the clerk's office into the mid-morning sunlight, Sarah stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed out slowly. "That is done, then," she said. "It is," Paul said. "The funds will be accessible within 10 business days once the transfer order goes through." She nodded. She was looking down the street toward the construction lot, toward the sound of hammering that was always present now, steady as a heartbeat, the building rising gradually into shape. "I know what I am going to do with it," she said. "The south porch," he said, and she laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, and it was the first time he had heard it without the slight reserve she usually carried, and it hit him somewhere low in the chest in a way that he chose not to immediately analyze. "The south porch," she confirmed, "and better bedding for the rooms, and a cook stove that is actually worth its name, and maybe a small stable at the back for guests who come on horseback." "A stable is a good idea," he said. "People traveling by horse need somewhere safe for their animals." She looked at him. He looked at her. The moments stretched between them in the October sunshine, and Paul was aware that his business in Harlan Creek was now technically complete. He had delivered the documents. The documents had been signed. The notary had done his notarial work and was probably already halfway back to wherever he had come from. There was nothing professional keeping Paul Carver in Harlan Creek, Colorado, any longer. "When are you leaving?" she asked. Her voice was level and her face was composed, but she was asking the question and they both knew she was asking it, and it was not really a question about travel logistics. He was quiet for a moment. "I have not decided," he said, which was true. He had been not deciding for several days. "My father's letters," she said then, not quite as a change of subject. "The sealed letter that came with the estate papers. I read it last night." He waited. "He wrote it 3 years ago," she said. "He was already sick by then, though I did not know it at the time. He said that he had been saving that money for me specifically, because he did not want it swallowed up in his other debts and arrangements. He said he wanted me to have something that was entirely mine, to do with as I saw fit, with no strings and no instructions." She paused, and then he wrote one thing at the end. He said, "Do something that outlasts you, Sarah. That is all a life is, really. Do something that outlasts you." Paul did not say anything for a long moment. He simply held what she had said, let it settle. "He sounds like he was a remarkable man," Paul said finally. "He was complicated," she said, and there was love and grief and honesty all mixed together in those 2 words, the kind of honesty that only comes with time and distance. "But yes, remarkable is right." Paul made a decision then, standing on that sidewalk. He made it the way he made most of his important decisions, by listening to the part of himself that did not speak in the language of logic and legal precedent, but in something older and more direct. "I need to send a letter to Denver," he said, "to the firm, explaining that I am remaining in Harlan Creek for an extended period. There is apparently a water rights question that a local rancher wants assistance with, and I have found that I am useful to the construction crew more than I expected, and I have not had fresh air like this in years." Sarah Lockhart looked at him with those Creekwater eyes, and the smile that had been hovering at the corner of her mouth arrived fully. "That is a great many reasons," she said. "I am a lawyer," he said. "I present evidence thoroughly." She shook her head slightly, smiling still, and turned toward the construction site. "Come on then," she said. "Bert Calloway wants to talk about the second-floor beams, and he is less likely to argue if there is a second person looking at the numbers." He fell into step beside her, and they walked together through the dusty October morning toward the sound of hammers and rising wood. And Paul Carver noticed that, when they walked, he matched his pace to hers without thinking about it, and that she did not seem to mind being matched. The weeks that followed were the most peculiar and satisfying of Paul's professional life, which he acknowledged to himself was not a very high bar given that his professional life had been spent largely in offices surrounded by papers, but peculiar and satisfying nonetheless. He wrote to Denver and explained the water rights matter, which was genuine, and which Webb the rancher was genuinely grateful for, and he took on 2 additional small legal matters in the surrounding county that justified his continued presence in a strictly technical sense. His senior partner Dunmore wrote back with the tone of a man who suspected something was occurring that was not entirely about water rights, but who was too wise or too amused to make an accusation of it directly. He spent his mornings at the construction site, and his afternoons on legal work, and his evenings in conversation with Sarah. Sometimes they ate at the diner on the main street, a place called Hazel's where the beef stew was good, and the coffee was strong, and the woman named Hazel who ran it had no patience for pretension of any kind. Sometimes they sat on the porch of Mrs. Wickfield's house in the cooling evening air and talked about everything and nothing, about the law and about construction, and about Sarah's years in St. Louis and Paul's childhood in Ohio, and the strange paths that had brought them both to this small Colorado town at this particular moment. He learned that she was 26 and had been engaged once to a man in St. Louis who had wanted her to be still and decorative and had eventually realized she was neither of those things and had been honest enough to say so, which she had ultimately respected even though it had hurt at the time. He told her about his own history of near relationships that had somehow never quite become relationships, women who were lovely and interesting, and with whom something had always been slightly misaligned, some fundamental incompatibility of pace or direction that he could never quite articulate. "Maybe you need someone who is going somewhere," Sarah said one evening, and it was one of those statements that floated between observation and implication, and he let it float for a moment before he answered. "I think you are right about that," he said. She looked at him across the porch in the last gray light of a November evening, and he looked back at her, and there was a great deal said in that look without any of it being put into words yet. November in the Colorado mountains came in cold and purposeful. The first snow dusted the distant peaks and then came lower, and Sarah redoubled the pace of work on the building because she wanted the roof and walls closed before winter bit too hard. She pushed the crew and she pushed herself, arriving at the site before dawn and leaving after dark, and Paul was there for most of it, lifting and fetching and calculating, and occasionally arguing cheerfully with Bert Calloway about structural approaches, arguments which Bert usually won because Bert had 30 years of building behind him and was right more often than not, but which Paul contributed to usefully often enough that Bert had stopped glaring at him and now offered him coffee from his own battered tin pot, which was in Bert's language the equivalent of a formal declaration of friendship. One afternoon in the second week of November, a man rode into town who called himself Arden Voss, and who went directly to the saloon and drank for 2 hours and then walked down the main street to the construction lot, and stood at the edge of it looking at the building with an expression that Sarah, who could read expressions the way some people read weather, did not like at all. She came down from the second floor, which was now fully framed and partially planked, and walked to where Voss was standing. Paul, who had been reviewing a set of measurements with Bert, noticed the conversation from across the site and watched it without appearing to watch it. Voss was perhaps 45, heavyset, with the particular look of a man who had spent years getting what he wanted through implication rather than direct statement. He wore a good coat and a silver watch chain and an air of studied casualness that did not quite conceal something harder underneath. "You are the Lockhart woman," he said. "I am Sarah Lockhart," she said. "I knew your father." He looked at the building. "He owed me money, quite a bit of money. I thought I would come by and introduce myself, now that you have come into some funds." Sarah looked at him steadily. "My father's debts were settled with his estate at the time of his passing. The county clerk has records of every creditor paid. If you have a claim that was not addressed, you will need to present it to the court in Denver with documentation, because I have been told there are no remaining claims against the estate." Voss smiled in a way that did not involve his eyes. These were informal arrangements, the kind that are not necessarily in the records. "Then they are not legal obligations," Sarah said. "I recommend you speak with an attorney before you pursue this line of thinking." "Good afternoon." She turned and walked back toward the building. Voss watched her go, and his expression shifted into something that made Paul set down the measurements he had been holding and walk across the lot. "Something I can help you with," Paul said, arriving at Voss's side with the measured pleasantness of a man who has been in enough legal situations to know how to make a simple question carry weight. Voss looked at him. "And who are you?" "Paul Carver, attorney, Denver. I handled the Lockhart estate documents." He let that settle. "Every creditor claim associated with that estate was reviewed and adjudicated. I am familiar with the file in considerable detail." Voss looked from Paul to Sarah, who had climbed back up to the second floor and resumed work without looking down, and then back to Paul. Whatever calculation he was making, he made it quickly. "Just a visit," he said, and turned and walked back toward the saloon. Paul watched him go and then looked up at Sarah, who was nailing planking with the focused efficiency she brought to everything, and he thought about the fact that she had not needed him to step in. She had handled it entirely herself, and that the satisfaction he felt was not about having been useful but about having been there. That evening, when he told her about his exchange with Voss, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "Thank you, although I meant what I said to him." "Every word of it was legally accurate," Paul confirmed. "Do you think he will be trouble?" "Men like that usually decide that easier targets are more profitable," Paul said. "But it would not hurt to have a record. I can draft a letter noting the interaction and have it filed with the county clerk just to establish a timeline." She looked at him. "You are thinking ahead. It is a lawyer habit." "It is a good habit," she said, and there was something warm in her voice, a recognition of his usefulness not as something flattering to him but as something genuinely felt. He had learned the difference with Sarah. She did not offer compliments as social currency. When she said something appreciative, she meant it precisely. Voss did not come back. The letter was filed. The building continued to rise. The roof went on in the third week of November, a cold and brilliant day when the sky over the mountains was the particular blue that only exists above a certain altitude, and when the last beam was set and the first shingles were laid. Bert Calloway produced a bottle of whiskey from somewhere, and the whole crew took a measure of it in battered tin cups, and Sarah stood in the middle of it all with a cup in her hand, and looked up at the sky through the new roofline of the building she had built from a cleared lot, and a set of plans, and a piece of land her father had left her. And her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the cold wind. Paul stood beside her and held his cup and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would not have been less than what the moment was. After the crew dispersed and Bert had packed up his tools, Paul and Sarah stood alone in the shell of the building as the light went gold and then copper, and then began to dim toward evening. Their breath made small clouds in the cold air, and the building around them smelled of fresh-cut lumber and sawdust and pine resin, and the particular clean sharpness of Colorado winter. "It is real," she said. She was turning slowly, looking at the interior, at the skeleton of rooms taking shape, at the staircase that still needed its railing, at the large front windows that Hodges had finally delivered. "It is real," Paul agreed. She stopped turning and looked at him, and in the fading light of the late November afternoon in that unfinished room that smelled of fresh wood and possibility, Sarah Lockhart looked at Paul Carver with an openness that she did not always allow, and he felt it like sunlight. "Paul," she said. "Yes," he said, though she had not asked anything yet. She almost smiled. "I was going to say something practical." "You can say something practical." "I'm going to need someone to help me draft a set of official house rules and policies for the boarding house, the kind that hold up if there are ever any disputes about terms." "I can do that," he said, "and I suspect I will need occasional legal consultation as the business develops." "I suspect that is true," which would require someone with legal knowledge to be reasonably nearby. He was quiet for a moment, holding the thread of what she was weaving, where it was going. "Harlan Creek seems to have a genuine need for legal services," he said carefully. "Webb's water rights case alone will take months to resolve properly. And I have heard there is a property dispute in the next county that no one has been able to untangle. So there is work for you here," she said. "There is work for me here," he confirmed. She held his gaze. There was no more practical language between them, just the look, steady and clear and full of everything that had been accumulating through all the mornings with coffee and all the evenings on the porch and all the arguments about roofline geometry. He moved first, one step that closed most of the remaining distance between them, and she did not move back or look away. "Sarah," he said. "Yes," she said, just as he had, though she had not asked anything yet either. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, the kind of gesture that is so gentle and specific that it carries more weight than anything elaborate. Her eyes did not leave his. "I'm not leaving Harlan Creek," he said. "I want you to know that is not dependent on anything. I'm not leaving regardless of anything else. But I want you to know also that the reason I am not leaving is not only the work." "I know," she said softly. "I want to court you properly," he said. "If you are willing, I want to do this the right way." The smile that arrived then was one he had not seen before, something private and warm and entirely without reserve. "Paul Carver," she said, "I have been watching you drive nails with my construction crew for 6 weeks. I think we are slightly past the formal introduction stage." He laughed, a genuine one, and it surprised him with its own lightness. "Fair enough. May I take you to dinner this evening then, properly, at the best establishment Harlan Creek has to offer?" "Hazel serves a very good beef stew," she said solemnly. "Hazel's it is." He offered his arm with a formality that was only slightly ironic, and she took it with a dignity that was only slightly laughing, and they walked out of the unfinished boarding house into the cold December twilight of Harlan Creek, Colorado, into the first evening of something that both of them could already feel was not small. Dinner at Hazel's was warm and loud and utterly unromantic in atmosphere, and somehow entirely romantic in experience. Hazel herself, a woman of perhaps 50 with iron-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, brought them coffee without being asked, and planted a bottle of apple brandy on their table with the announcement that it was cold outside and they looked like they could use it, and then retreated to the kitchen with an expression of pure satisfaction at having correctly read the room. They talked through dinner and through 2 cups of coffee each and through a shared slice of dried apple pie, and the conversation moved like water finding its level, easily, naturally, covering years of life and thought and feeling without any of it feeling forced or performed. Paul told her about his parents, his father the carpenter and his mother who had been a school teacher in Ohio and who had read to him every night until he was old enough to read to her in turn. Sarah told him about her mother, who had died when Sarah was 11 and whose memory lived in the way Sarah took her coffee and the particular songs she sometimes hummed without realizing it. She told him about learning to drive nails at the age of 9, because her father had believed that knowing how to build a thing and how to fix a thing were the most fundamental skills a person could have. She told him about the years in St. Louis that had given her education and refinement and also a deep and abiding appreciation for open sky. She told him about the man she had been engaged to, not bitterly, but honestly, with the clear-eyed understanding that it had been a mismatch of fundamental vision, that he had wanted one kind of life, and she had needed another. Paul listened with the quality of attention that is rarer than intelligence, the ability to be genuinely present with what another person is saying rather than merely waiting for a space to speak. He asked questions that were specific and thoughtful, questions that showed he had absorbed what she had told him and was curious about the real shape of it. Walking back through Harlan Creek in the cold night air, their breath making small clouds and the stars very bright and very close in the mountain sky, he held her hand and she let him, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. He walked her to the Wickfield house, and they stood on the porch in the starlight, and he did not presume anything beyond what the evening had been, which was perfect. He took her hand and held it for a moment and looked at her. "Thank you for this evening," he said. "Thank you for staying," she said. And she meant all of it, every day of it, the coffee and the measurements and the legal documents and the conversation and tonight. He kissed her hand and said good night and walked back down Elm Street, and Sarah stood on the porch for a while after he had gone, looking up at the sky that her father had loved, and she did something she had not done in a very long time. She allowed herself to feel entirely happy about something that was not yet fully formed, not yet certain, still becoming. She allowed herself to want it without immediately building defenses around the wanting. That, for Sarah Lockhart, was its own kind of building. December in Harlan Creek was beautiful and merciless in the way of high-country Colorado winters, the cold arriving with authority and settling in for its long stay. The boarding house exterior was complete, and the interior work was underway, plastering and painting, and the careful installation of the wood stove and cook stove that Sarah had sourced from a supplier in Glenwood Springs after weeks of negotiation. The rooms took shape one by one, each one different in minor ways, because Sarah believed that a room should have a character of its own, a different quilt pattern here, a different arrangement of windows there, a particular hook by the door where a traveling person could hang things that mattered. Paul had officially established a small legal office in a rented room above the land office on the main street. His shingle was modest, just his name and the word attorney beneath it, but it had brought him 3 clients in the first 2 weeks and more inquiries after that. Webb's water rights case was proceeding, and the property dispute in the next county had turned out to involve a forged deed, which was more interesting and more serious than anyone had initially supposed, and which kept Paul busy in a way that satisfied him. He and Sarah saw each other every day. Sometimes it was brief, a shared coffee in the early morning, a conversation at the end of the working day. Sometimes it was long, an evening talking through plans and problems and ideas, or a Sunday afternoon walking the ridge above town where the views of the mountain range spread out in every direction, staggering and humbling and entirely real. They were careful with each other in a way that was not timid but deliberate, building something between them with the same attention they each brought to their respective work, thoughtfully, not rushing, but not pretending either. The people of Harlan Creek, who missed nothing about their own town, had clearly cataloged the situation from an early date and regarded it with the warmth that small communities extend toward things that look like good outcomes. Hazel always gave them the corner table. Mrs. Wickfield had taken to baking extra when Paul came around for the evening. Bert Calloway, who was not a sentimental man by nature, told Paul one morning while they were looking at the staircase railing that he thought Sarah Lockhart was the finest person in Harlan Creek, and that any man who messed that up was a fool and would have Bert Calloway to answer to, and then handed Paul a hammer and told him to hold the railing brace while he drilled, which was Bert's way of considering the matter closed. It was during the 3rd week of December, 4 days before Christmas, that Paul and Sarah had their first real argument. It was about the sign. Sarah had designed a sign for the front of the boarding house, painted by a man in town who had the skill for it, and it read simply the Lockhart house in neat, dark letters. Paul, who had been looking at the sign when it was installed on the front of the building, said something about how clean and strong it looked, and then mentioned, in passing, that in his experience a boarding house with a more descriptive name sometimes attracted more travelers who were unfamiliar with the locale. Sarah had taken that as criticism of her choice and had said so directly, and Paul had clarified that it was not criticism but genuine observation, and Sarah had pointed out that she had not asked for his observations, and Paul had said that friends generally offered observations without being asked, and that was what made them friends rather than mere acquaintances. And Sarah had looked at him with a sharpness in her eyes and said that there was a difference between offering observations and implying that a person's considered decisions needed revision. They stood in the cold front yard of the boarding house with the new sign above them and had a brisk, heated, entirely honest argument that lasted approximately 6 minutes and covered the sign and then, more honestly, covered the larger question of what it meant to be in a partnership of any kind and how much of one person's judgment the other person was prepared to trust without question. At the end of it, Paul said, "You are right. The sign is your decision. It is your building and it is your name on it, and I should have said it was fine because it is fine. It is better than fine. I am sorry." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and then the sharpness went out of her expression. "And you are right that I was too quick to take offense at a comment that was genuinely meant. I am sorry for that." They stood in the cold for another moment. "The sign is perfect," Paul said. "I know it is," Sarah said, but she was smiling now, and it was the particular smile that admitted she was being slightly ridiculous and found it funny. He reached out and took her hand. "I am learning," he said, "how to be around someone like you. I'm not always going to get it right immediately." "Neither am I," she said, "around someone like you." "What is someone like me?" he said, genuinely curious. She considered it seriously. "Someone who thinks carefully about everything and then says what he thinks even when I have not asked, because he believes honestly shared thoughts are more respectful than comfortable silence." She paused, "which is actually a quality I admire, but I am also stubborn." "I had noticed," he said. "Was that an observation I did not ask for? It was a statement of documented fact." She laughed. He squeezed her hand. The argument was over, thoroughly and honestly, and what remained in its place was something more solid than what had been there before it. Christmas in Harlan Creek was a community affair, with the church full on Christmas Eve and a gathering at the community hall on Christmas Day that ran long into the evening. Paul sat beside Sarah at the Christmas service, and they sang hymns together, and her voice was clear and slightly off-key in the upper register, and he found it wonderful. He had brought her a gift, a small leather-bound notebook with her initials pressed into the cover, for plans and measurements and ideas, because he had been paying attention to the fact that she was constantly writing things on scraps of lumber and the backs of old papers. She gave him a gift in return, a case of good writing implements, pens and good ink and a quality blotter, because she had noticed that he was using inferior tools for his legal documents, and it clearly irritated him even though he never said so. They looked at each other's gifts, and then at each other, and the mutual accuracy of what they had each chosen said more about how closely they had been attending to one another than any number of formal declarations could have. "Happy Christmas, Paul," she said. "Happy Christmas, Sarah," he said. He kissed her then, gently and briefly, the first time in the Christmas evening, with the snow falling outside and the lamplight warm on both their faces. She kissed him back with a steadiness that was exactly who she was, not tentative, not overflowing, just entirely present, and when they separated they were both quiet for a moment. "I have been wanting to do that for approximately 2 months, he said. "I know," she said. "You knew." "Paul, I am in construction. I read structures." He laughed and she laughed, and somewhere across the hall Hazel caught the laughter and raised her cup of cider with a knowing satisfaction, and Mrs. Wickfield dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief and blamed it on the candle smoke. January came in hard and snowy and beautiful, and the boarding house interior was nearly finished. Sarah was making decisions about furnishings with the same thoroughness she brought to structural choices, visiting a furniture maker in the town of Randall 2 hours south, and making selections with a careful eye for quality and comfort over mere appearance. The rooms were painted and aired, the bedding ordered from a supplier in Denver, the kitchen equipped with the seriousness of someone who understood that good food in a decent kitchen was the foundation of a reputation worth having. Paul helped where he could and stayed out of the way where he should, a balance he was getting better at, reading the difference between when Sarah wanted company and when she wanted the kind of solitude in which a person does their clearest thinking. He had his own work, and he threw himself into it with a genuine engagement that Harlan Creek was helping him recover, the sense that the law, when practiced in direct service of people who actually needed it, was more alive than it had felt in a long time in Denver. Webb's water rights case was resolved in late January in Webb's favor, which delighted Webb and cemented Paul's reputation in the county as someone who understood what he was doing. The forged deed case was more complicated and would take longer but was progressing. He wrote to Dunmore in Denver occasionally, updating the firm on the ongoing cases, and Dunmore's replies grew shorter and more cheerful over time, which meant the older man had accepted the situation and was pleased by it, which was as close to explicit approval as Dunmore generally came. In February, on a clear cold morning when the sun on the snow was almost blinding, Sarah took Paul through the boarding house room by room, every finished room, and he walked through each one with her, and understood exactly what Dollar's raise had meant to her aunt in St. Louis, because these rooms had been made with that same quality of intention. There were flowers in the public rooms, dried ones because it was winter and what could you do, but flowers nonetheless. There was a shelf of books in the common room for guests who wanted something to read. The kitchen was warm and efficient. The south porch had been built as planned, with a good railing and 2 rocking chairs that would catch the summer shade of the eave. "It is magnificent," he said, and he meant it with the specificity that she had taught him to use with words. It was not a compliment. It was an accurate assessment. She stood in the center of the main room and looked around at what she had made from a cleared lot and a set of plans and her father's money and her own relentless effort, and he stood beside her and watched her face. "He would have liked this," she said softly, her father. "He did not need to ask. He would have been proud of you," Paul said. "He would have argued with me about the porch railing design," she said, and laughed a little, with tears close behind the laugh. And Paul put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him for a moment, not dramatically, just a human being who has built something enormous and is for 1 minute allowing herself to rest in the presence of someone she trusts. He held her and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. The Lockhart house opened for business on the 1st of March, 1883. The town of Harlan Creek turned out for it with the enthusiasm that small towns reserve for genuine events. Hazel brought food. Mrs. Wickfield brought flowers. Bert Calloway stood in the doorway and looked at the roof with the expression of a craftsman recognizing his own work, and found it satisfactory, which from Bert was a rousing endorsement. The first 3 guests arrived that very afternoon, a traveling merchant and his wife and their grown son, who took the 2 best rooms and were effusive about the quality of both. Sarah moved through the opening with the controlled excitement of someone who is happy but does not want to lose their head, greeting everyone, making sure the rooms were right, overseeing the kitchen where a woman named Josephine, who she had hired as cook in February, was producing coffee and molasses cake, and something savory that everyone found irresistible. Paul watched her work and felt something so specific and so full in his chest that he had to stand still for a moment to let it settle. He found her late in the evening, after the guests had gone to their rooms and the townspeople had gone home and Josephine had cleaned the kitchen and gone to her own house 2 streets over. Sarah was sitting in one of the common room chairs with her shoes off and her feet tucked up beside her, looking at the lit fireplace with a quality of stillness that she rarely allowed herself. He sat in the other chair and they were quiet together for a while, the fire crackling and the house around them solid and warm and smelling of good wood and the remnants of good food. "How does it feel?" he said. "Like it is really happening," she said. "Like it is not just a plan anymore." "You did this," he said. She looked at him. "Not entirely on my own." "Largely on your own," he said. "I held some boards." "You held considerably more than that," she said, and her voice was quiet and certain. "You held me steady more than once without making it feel like anything other than choosing to be nearby. That is not a small thing, Paul." He looked at her across the fire-lit room. This woman who had come back to a town that had expected her to leave and had instead built something permanent and good, who argued about roofline geometry and wrote plans in the margins of lumber scraps, and had cried exactly once in his presence, and then been entirely herself again 30 seconds later, who made him think better and feel more and want things he had stopped expecting to want. "Sarah," he said. "I know," she said, which was both maddening and completely accurate. "I love you," he said, because it was time to say it past time, and he was not a man who left important things unsaid for the sake of decorum when decorum had already long been left behind. She was quiet for a long moment that was not a hesitation but a holding of something precious before speaking it out loud. "I love you," she said. "I have loved you for a while. Since about the time you worked out that roofline calculation on the back of a legal pad and Bert Calloway took the paper without saying thank you and you did not mind at all." "That was October," he said. "Yes, it was," she said. "You waited 3 months to tell me." "I was building a boarding house," she said. "I was busy." He crossed the room and sat on the arm of her chair, and she looked up at him and he looked down at her, and the firelight moved across both their faces. "Marry me," he said. "I am not asking because it is what comes next in a particular sequence. I am asking because I cannot think of anything I want more than to spend my life in the company of someone who argues with lumber suppliers and puts flowers in a boarding house in the middle of winter and climbs wall frames without the slightest concern for her own safety." She looked at him for a long moment with those green-gold eyes, steady and clear. "I will marry you," she said, "not because it is what comes next. Because you showed up in October with a satchel full of papers and stayed because it was worth staying, and you have been worth every minute of your own staying." He bent and kissed her, and she kissed him back in the firelight of the house she had built, and outside the Colorado winter pressed against the windows, and inside everything was warm. They were married on the 15th of April, 1883, when the last snow had finally retreated from the lower elevations, and the first green was showing on the hillsides above Harlan Creek. The church at the end of the main street got its best attendance since Christmas, and Reverend Aldrich, who had been hoping for a good wedding for years, conducted the ceremony with a joy that was entirely unperformed. Sarah wore a dress of deep sage green that she had sewn with help from Mrs. Wickfield over the previous 2 months, practical in cut and beautiful in its simplicity. And she carried dried larkspur because nothing else was in season, and she liked the color. Paul stood at the front of the church in his best coat, which was not his mud-stained arrival coat, but the good one he had brought in a bag from Denver and which fit him properly. And when Sarah came down the aisle on the arm of Eb Fletcher, who had volunteered because Sarah had no remaining family in the county, and who was clearly delighted to perform the role, Paul's face did a thing it did not often do. It stopped composing itself and just showed what it felt. The vows were the traditional ones, and they said them clearly, and with the directness that was characteristic of both of them. When Reverend Aldrich pronounced them married, and Paul kissed his wife for the first time in front of the assembled people of Harlan Creek, there was a noise from the congregation that was partway between applause and the general release of collective feeling that had been building since October. Hazel had made a wedding dinner. Of course, Hazel had made a wedding dinner. She had the long table at the diner laid out with things she had been preparing for 3 days, and the wedding party relocated there immediately after the ceremony and stayed for 3 hours, during which Bert Calloway gave a toast that was 17 words long and entirely perfect. And Mrs. Wickfield wept in a way that she made no attempt to manage. And Eb Fletcher told a story about Thomas Lockhart that made Sarah laugh so hard she had to set down her glass. A story about her father trying to build a birdhouse and producing something that no self-respecting bird would occupy, and laughing and grief all together, which is the way love stories end and continue at the same time. Paul and Sarah walked home to the boarding house that evening as husband and wife, through the spring dark of Harlan Creek with the smell of new growth on the air, and the building her father's land and her father's money in her own hands had made Rose solid and warm against the stars, the Lockhart house in its neat painted letters above the door, and she looked at it and he looked at her looking at it. "Should we change the name now?" he said. "Absolutely not," she said. He smiled. "Good. The sign is perfect." "I know it is," she said, and opened the door of her house and her home and her future, and he followed her inside. The spring of 1883 rolled into summer with the particular extravagance that Colorado did when it finally decided to be warm, wildflowers on every hillside, and the creek running high and cold from the snowmelt, and the sky overhead an unreasonable blue. The Lockhart house was seldom less than half occupied and often entirely full, travelers heading west, cattle buyers heading east, a schoolteacher taking a position in the next town who stayed 2 weeks while she settled her arrangements, a circuit judge who came through quarterly and always booked the same room. Sarah ran the boarding house with Josephine's help and managed the books herself, and found that she was good at it in a way that went beyond simple capability. She was genuinely suited to the particular mix of hospitality and management that the work required. She knew her guests' names and their coffee preferences within 24 hours of their arrival, exactly as Dolores Ray's had done, and the reputation of the Lockhart house spread along the road between Denver and the Western Territories in the quiet, reliable way that good establishments always do, not through advertisement, but through the testimony of people who had been treated well and remembered it. Paul's practice grew steadily. He took on a junior clerk in June, a young man of 20 named Amos who had come west from Missouri with ambitions for the law and who was quick and earnest and learned fast. The water rights work and the property dispute work and the various estate and contract matters that the region generated kept both of them busy. And Paul was building something too, a practice that was rooted in this particular place and its particular needs, which was different from Denver in ways that made him feel more directly useful and more genuinely connected to the work he was doing. In September of 1883, Sarah told Paul that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen of the boarding house on a Sunday morning when Josephine was not in and the guests were all out, and she told him directly, the way she did everything, watching his face. His face, again, did the thing it did not often do. It simply showed what it felt, which was a joy so complete that it seemed to require the whole of his expression to contain it. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and held her, and she held him back, and they stood in the kitchen of the house she had built in the morning light, this man and this woman who had found each other sideways, through a satchel of legal papers and a construction site and weeks of morning coffee, and the future stretched out ahead of them, enormous and particular and entirely real. Daniel Thomas Carver came into the world on the 23rd of March, 1884, on a cold, clear Colorado morning, when the sun was just coming up over the eastern ridge, and the town of Harlan Creek was still largely asleep. He was born with a full head of dark hair and his mother's steady eyes, and a voice that expressed its opinions about the world immediately and without reserve, which Sarah said was exactly right, and Paul said suggested a future in law or building or both. Reverend Aldrich christened him Daniel Thomas, the Thomas for Sarah's father, and Harlan Creek took to the baby with the enthusiasm of a small town that understands that new people are investments in the future. Hazel knit him a blanket. Bert Calloway built him a cradle without being asked, delivered it to the boarding house with the explanation that it was a practical matter, and that a baby needed somewhere to sleep, and he had some spare wood, which Paul correctly interpreted as deep affection expressed in the only language Bert used with confidence. Josephine proved an invaluable presence during those first weeks, managing the boarding house kitchen and the daily operations with an authority that freed Sarah to recover properly and spend the time with her son that she needed and wanted. Paul worked morning hours and returned by midday, and the evenings were family evenings in the private quarters behind the boarding house's public rooms, the rooms that were theirs, warmly furnished and filled with the particular comfortable disorder of a household that is genuinely lived in. He watched her with the baby in the lamplight of their sitting room, this woman who could climb wall frames and argue with lumber suppliers and manage a business with precision, holding this small new person with a tenderness that was entirely consistent with all of it, because tenderness and capability were not opposites, and she had always been both. He felt a love so layered and specific that he could not have articulated it fully in any language, legal or otherwise. He tried sometimes, late in the evenings when Daniel was asleep and they sat together in the quiet. "You know," he said one evening, about 6 weeks after Daniel arrived, "when I rode into Harlan Creek I expected to find a woman who needed what I was bringing her. And instead," she said, "and instead I found a woman who had already decided what she needed and was in the middle of building it," he said, "and I thought for about 10 minutes that my trip had been unnecessary. And then I looked at you standing on that wall frame with a hammer in your hand at 7 in the morning, and I thought, well, something is happening here, and I am not entirely sure what it is yet, but I am not getting back on the stagecoach until I find out." She looked at him with great fondness. "You stayed for 3 weeks waiting for a notary." "I stayed because of you," he said simply. "The notary was a convenient excuse that the universe provided." She reached across and took his hand. "I am glad the notary was delayed." "So am I," he said, "every day." The year 1884 gave way to 1885, and the Lockhart house continued to thrive, taking on the settled quality that a place gets when it has found its purpose, and its people have found their rhythm. Sarah hired a second assistant to help Josephine as the business grew, a young widow named Marta who proved to have a gift for making guests feel welcome from the first moment. And the Lockhart house became known not just as a clean and comfortable stop on the road west, but as a place that travelers went slightly out of their way to reach. Paul's practice had grown to the point that Amos had been elevated from clerk to full associate, handling his own cases under Paul's supervision, and the little office above the land office had been replaced by a proper set of rooms on the main street with real furniture and a proper waiting area, and a framed certificate on the wall. Webb, whose water rights case Paul had won, told anyone who would listen that Paul Carver was the most useful attorney in a 4-county radius, and that this was a simple fact and not a compliment, which was Webb's particular style of the highest praise. There were difficulties, as there always are, cases that were harder than expected. A dry summer in 1885 that reduced travel on the road, and therefore the boarding house occupancy for 2 months. A dispute with a neighboring property owner about the boundary of the boarding house's stable yard that required careful management and reminded Paul that legal matters are never purely abstract. They involve real people with real feelings about real ground. But they navigated these things together, with the honest and direct communication that was their established way, talking through problems at the kitchen table or on the south porch in the evening, 2 people who had learned each other well enough to be useful to each other in all the actual circumstances of life. In the spring of 1886, Sarah told Paul that she was expecting again. This time she told him in the dining room of the Lockhart house during the brief window between breakfast service and the guests' morning departures. And Daniel, who was too and entirely opinionated about his world, was sitting on the floor nearby, constructing something architectural and ambitious from several wooden blocks that Bert Calloway had made him. Paul looked at Sarah, and then at Daniel, and then at Sarah again, and the expression on his face was the same one from before, undisguised and full. "How are you feeling?" he asked, because he had learned that this was the right first question. "Well," she said, "tired in the mornings, but well." He came around the table and kissed her forehead, and she leaned into him for a moment. And Daniel looked up from his construction and said something demanding in the language of 2-year-olds that required immediate parental attention, and life continued in its particular and irreplaceable way. Me, Elizabeth Carver, arrived in October of 1886, in the bright-leafed Colorado autumn, a small and imperious person who announced her presence with considerable force, and who, from the first days of her life, made it clear that she had opinions about everything, and would be sharing them continuously. Daniel received his sister with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has been thoughtfully prepared, and who has decided to be magnanimous about it, and me received Daniel's magnanimous acceptance with the expression of someone who has been granted something she fully expected and finds the granting merely appropriate. Sarah looked at both her children in the particular evening light of their family sitting room and felt the fullness of what she had built: this life, this house, this work, this love. It was more than her father had been able to leave her. It was more than the land and the money, though both of those had mattered. It was built on those things, but it had grown into something that was entirely its own, something that bore her name not just on the sign above the door, but in every room and every decision, and every morning when the guests came down for breakfast and found flowers on the table and someone who knew their name. She had built something that outlasted any single act. She had built something ongoing. One evening in the autumn of 1886, when me was a few weeks old and Daniel was asleep, and the boarding house was quiet around them, Paul found Sarah sitting on the south porch in the moonlight with a shawl around her shoulders, and the look on her face that meant she was thinking about several things at once. He brought 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and they looked out at the dark October town, at the lights in the windows of Harlan Creek, at the stars above the mountain ridgeline. "I read my father's letter again today," she said. "He waited. He said to do something that outlasts me," she said. "I keep thinking about that. I used to think it meant a building or a business. Something physical. And now," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Now I think he might have meant this too," she said. "All of it. The building and the business and you and Daniel and me and the people who have stayed here and felt welcome and went on their way carrying something they did not have before they arrived. All of it together." Paul looked at her profile in the moonlight, the line of her jaw and the way she held herself with that particular upright clarity that was simply who she was. And he thought about a morning in October 4 years ago when he had stepped down from a stagecoach with a satchel full of papers and a dead man's last wishes, and had walked toward a woman standing on a half-built wall frame with a hammer in her hand, a woman who had not needed to be saved or delivered or managed or guided, a woman who had needed exactly what she had and was already making it more than it was. He had come to deliver an inheritance. He had found someone who was already building something better than what she had inherited, and he had stayed and been allowed to be part of it, and it was the best thing he had ever done. "I think your father was right," Paul said, "on both counts." She looked at him, and in her eyes in the moonlight was everything they were together: the arguments and the laughter and the cold October mornings, and the Christmas evening by the fire and the wedding in the church, and Daniel arriving in the March dawn and me arriving in the autumn, and all the ordinary irreplaceable days between. The coffee and the conversations and the evenings on this porch, all of it, accumulated and specific and theirs. "He usually was," she said, and reached over and took his hand in the cool October air. They sat together on the porch of the Lockhart house, their home, with the stars very bright and the mountain air sharp and clean, and the sound of the town settling around them in the night. And the future was not a question or a plan or a set of documents to be signed and sealed. It was simply this: the ongoing, specific, daily, difficult, joyful, ordinary, extraordinary business of a life built alongside someone you had chosen, and who had chosen you, and who would keep choosing you in all the varied weather of everything that comes next. Inside, Daniel slept with his wooden blocks arranged around him like a small city of his own making. Me slept in her cradle, the one Bert Calloway had built for Daniel and that now held her, its solid Colorado pine still sound after 2.5 years. Josephine's kitchen was clean and ready for morning. The guest rooms were occupied and quiet. The sign above the front door, the Lockhart house, held its place against the night sky, and it was not going anywhere. Paul squeezed Sarah's hand and she squeezed his back, and the porch swing moved gently in the night air. And in Harlan Creek, Colorado, in the autumn of 1886, two people who had been brought together by a satchel of legal papers and a woman who refused to stop building sat in the moonlight and were entirely, completely, and permanently home.